Create and maintain a paint journal because you'll need it. There may not be as many paints or paint lines out there compared to the number of miniatures and miniature companies existing currently right now, but there are a lot of paints. Welcome to Hobby MoPro, the show for the miniature and scale hobbyists looking for more motivation and productivity in their YouTube feeds. My name is Louis of Louis Loves Minis, and today we'll be talking about how I use a paint journal and why you should use it too. Now, as a general reason, using a paint journal helps most types, if not all types of hobbyists that I'm aware of. Whether you're starting to paint, you consider yourself a veteran, or you're someone who's been in the hobby for a very, very long time, a paint journal goes a long way when you invest in it. As we preface it, there are a lot of brands existing right now. Those brands do have a lot of varieties of paints under them. They have the washes, they have the bases, they have the metallics, they have the inks, they have the oils. There are so many different varieties under a specific paint brand. And there are so many different brands of paints out there. And for you experienced hobbyists out there, you do know that you don't always stick to one paint brand, because you do know some varieties are better than the other varieties of other paints. Now, for example, Games Workshop, a company we're all familiar with, exclusively has contrast paints, but there are other brands that have a similar variety, such as inks and thicker washes that may perform just as well and produce a different effect. And over the course of time, as you go about experimenting, trying, learning, and adapting to these different products existing in the market right now, you'll figure out what works for you and what doesn't. A paint journal helps you remember that. Now, before I go on, let's define what I think a paint journal is. The word journaling, of course, is something I'm sure we're all familiar with, but applying that in a hobby is quite similar. We basically take down or remember the things or tools or paints that we used in a specific project. I personally like to take down steps on the bases, washes, inks, glazes, and other techniques that I've used, along with the colors and brands that I've used in a specific model or army. My paint journals are composed in that way, but I do know some people even take in stock the materials, the basing, the other building techniques they've adapted, and they write that down as they build a project. It may be written, it may be digital. I personally keep a mix of both. I prefer the digital form because it's easily shareable, which I'll show you guys later, and it's easy to save and access wherever you need to. Now, how to use this log of steps, tools, and paints used in the hobby is quite useful if you are an army painter. To the vast majority of us out there, we are army painters. We paint in batches, we paint in long sessions, we paint one color through a lot of different models before we go through the next color. And more often than not, we need to depend on that same type or value of paint, that same type of blue, that same shade of green, every time we apply it on every different model of our army, because we want the army to look uniformed. The moment we get a different shade of green and apply it on a different model, it will stand out, whether that's intentional or not. That's why a lot of miniature brands who cater to the wargaming aspect of the hobby like to have different shades of different reds and greens, because they know that people have a specific green they want to keep consistent. Imagine mixing the perfect shade of green for your army and having to repeat that perfect ratio every time you start the session. Getting the right bottle for the first time and remembering that bottle is very, very critical. Having that paint journal will always make us remember what's the exact red we used for this exact part of the miniature. Though it may not seem trivial at the moment, but when you do move on to another army, when you do move on to another project, and as you grow as a hobbyist, you might find yourself going back to the first hobby you worked on, and you want to remember what shade or color of red you used for that model, because maybe a new model for that army came out and you want to paint it in that scheme, or you want to revisit that scheme and create a new army or refreshen that scheme altogether. Having that paint journal logs in what you've used as a reference, whether you want to do it again, whether you want to improve on it, or whether you want to just experiment on it. And as army painters, you definitely just want to repeat the same process you've done before to keep with the continuity. As a side note, keeping track of the paints you use is also my personal way of making my paint journal act as an inventory of the paints I already own. If it's not in my paint journal, I probably don't own that type of paint. Therefore, if I'm buying new paint, I can easily check out my paint journal and see, yep, I already have this bag at home. No need to buy that same bottle, which I think I don't have because I have it in my paint journal. And speaking of buying of new paints, sometimes we've used the paint bottle so much that the label is rubbed off, or when we're out to buy a refill of that bottle and it's been years since we used that paint, we forgot what paint we're missing. I look into the paint journal and see the type of paint I've used for this specific type of project, and I can immediately find the brown that I'm looking for. The idea here is that the paint journal helps army painters keep consistent color schemes despite the change in products, despite the change in time, despite the change in activities that you do as you grow. This is a long-term effort and project that you'd want to keep as a habit as part of your hobby to make sure your projects look consistent as possible. If you're a commission painter like me, I keep a separate paint journal just in case the client does come back and wants me to replicate that same paint scheme for a different project. Or sometimes I do like to experiment with my commissions, and if something goes well and my client sends me another project and says, this is the type of paint scheme I want, the same thing that you did previously, I could easily refer to that journal. Now, while you may think I am forgetful, I am, but I do know for a fact commissions can come in different times, and I could have a client today that will come back in 6 months from now, and I may have forgotten the paint scheme that I've used for this specific project. But if he comes back to me saying, this is the miniature you've painted for me 6 months ago, I want the same thing for this fresh kit, I'll have my paint journal to refer that to. And lastly, as a display painter, experimenting and trying new things is a great way to grow. Taking stock of what you tried, what works after the experiment and what doesn't work, is a great way to find your style or your defining method of painting as a display painter. Did you like this color when it was dry brushed? Did you like this color when it was washed over a different color? Did you like glazing with this contrast, or did you prefer glazing with this base coat? Taking into consideration the techniques, tools, and brands of paint all together in your journal will help you develop and understand your tools at hand. And more importantly, they'll help you remember what you already know or what you have already tried, so that you don't repeat projects or you don't repeat things you don't like the outcome of. I'm sure you can relate when I say that you've painted a miniature and it came out totally far from your mind, even if you had a paint plan. And most of the time when a miniature comes out in the way that I did like, I refer to my paint plan and I can pinpoint it's the paint choice. It's the reason why it messed up. It's the technique is the reason why it's messed up. But most of the time it's really how I applied it. But at least that paint job helps me deduce and refer to what doesn't work, so that the next time I work on my next display project, I can see the things that I have tried that have worked, I have tried that I could work on, and that I've tried and I really did like the outcome. Growth, consistency, and maybe even profitability are things that paint journals have helped me in the hobby thus far. I have two ways of maintaining paint journals. The first one is the easiest. Most phones already have a built-in note app, and I'm not very fancy with notes, although there are a lot of fancy notes. I prefer to keep things simple, and I use my built-in notes app for this. And I have a folder specifically for all my hobby stuff. And I keep a lot of hobby-related notes along with ideas for the vlog here, but I do have a separate folder just showing the paint schemes of my clients' commissions. I write down their name, I write down the project and the different paints, and even sometimes techniques that I've used. And even though most often than not I don't refer to them again and again, there are some projects like this Elder Army that keeps coming back to me every so often. I used to paint vehicles for this client, and now because he likes my vehicles, he started giving me his troops and his other models, and of course he wants to maintain that same paint scheme because this is an army painting commission scheme. Having this log of paint schemes that I've used helps me be a bit more productive. Once I get the kit, I don't need to think about it because it's in my paint journal, it's in my inventory. I can get straight to painting without having to plan it because I've planned it once and I don't need to plan it again. That's another benefit of having a paint journal. You don't have to repeat your plans over and over again because this guy helps you remember it. But most of the time, my paint journals are kept in my laptop. Again, there are lots of different applications you can use for keeping your paint journals. But in my case, I just use what is already there. And I prefer to use numbers on Mac, which is basically the Excel counterpart. And the reason why I try to use very generic apps is because it's easy to share, it's easy to transmute to a different platform if I need to. Having it easy to share and having it easily accessible is the closest thing you can get to having it on paper. The reason why I want it to be accessible is because I want to edit it or view it whenever I can. So if you check the comments below, I have linked a Google Sheet version of my personal paint schemes that I've saved over the years. I classify my personal paint schemes into the brand of models. Then I look at the type of models. So for in this case, I have Warhammer 40k, and then each sheet is each army list. And then I put together a list of the Games Workshop paints, which is the most expensive paints I regularly buy. And then I put aside an alternate color that I use as a cheaper alternative. Because you see, when I started out in the hobby, I bought the cheaper versions first. And then whenever those run out, I upgrade to the Games Workshop official paint schemes. Those two lists keep stock of what I currently have, but at the same time, make sure that I know the counterpart. And I juggle between my different Space Marine lists. Sometimes I'm painting Black Templars, sometimes I'm painting Ultramarines. Most of the time I'm painting Ultramarines. Now I'm painting Imperial Fists. While the paint schemes are very, very similar, I can still forget while I'm juggling the different commissions that I have. And this Excel sheet helps me remember what I use to paint this specific skull in this unit so that the skull and that character looks similar and that they're the same universe. You'll also see the different paint schemes I use for different 3D printers, paint schemes that I've used for different types of things. And I'll be showing you here photos of my Ultramarines, showing you the photos of my Black Templars, even my Death Guard that I've sold off, photos of my Imperial Fists, even some photos of the 3D miniatures that I've been painting over time. And the color schemes are shared there. And that Excel link that I've just shared with you is the third way on how I do things, which is basically keep my paint journals public. So on some of my Instagram posts and some of my YouTube videos, the paint schemes are there below, and those are the only places where I store the paint scheme for that specific miniature. Because for me, it's already there. Why repeat it? If I need to look at it, I just need to log on to YouTube and check out that paint scheme. Now, the last one may not be the most dependable one, but I find to be the most convenient, which is just literally writing it down on a piece of cardboard, piece of paper. For me, it's the least hassle. So I would prefer to make my paint schemes before or after a project. But if I'm winging it, I like to write it down because painting is a tactile activity and I like to keep everything I'm doing bundled together. So if it's tactile, I'll make sure my note-taking is tactile. This is actually the paint scheme for the dwarf that I painted in the previous video. So that's it. I'm sure a lot of you guys have some form of a paint journal and you may not even know it. I'm sure a lot of you guys already even subscribe to other people's paint journals or other people's guides. And other people's guides and using that as a paint journal is the same thing as well. In fact, my paint journal started out by just copying Games Workshop's color schemes. And that's great. And over time, I've just built my own versions. Over time, I've experimented. Over time, I felt this is better. I felt that this is a nicer color palette to stick to. So I applied that and tweaked my own personal paint scheme and paint journal rather. That's basically how I turned it into my own. So using someone else's paint scheme as a springboard is how I started. There's no shame in that, and you can use mine shared in the comments below as yours. I hope you guys enjoyed. this video, and that for those people who have never even considered writing down their paint schemes, I think now's the time to start. I think there's always a chance that someone will look at your miniature and say, wow, this is great. How did you do this? And you would want to answer that question, and you would want to answer that question for yourself. I hope you guys enjoyed watching. My name has been Louie of Louie Loves Minis, reminding you to hobby every day to keep the sprues away.